Welcome to Energy and Infrastructure from Ulteig, a podcast focused on technology, innovation, policy, and funding. Our podcast discusses the hot issues facing our industry today, interviewing experts, CEOs, elected officials, and the disruptors making an impact on our industry. Here is your host for today's podcast, Craig Davies, Ulteig's Director of Corporate Communications.
Hello, and welcome to Ultag's first podcast of 2021. In this episode, we'll be covering a wide range of issues and topics related to future trends in the critical lifeline sectors of power, renewables, transportation, and water. And we'll take some time to explore things like the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the shift in political power in our nation's capital, and we'll also discuss some of the new technology and innovation that's transforming America's infrastructure. Today, we've invited four of Ultag's market leaders to share their insights and expertise on trends related to these critical lifeline sectors. First, I'd like to welcome Aaron Lauinger, Ultag's Market Director for Transportation and Water. And if you've tuned into any of our previous podcasts, you'll know that Aaron normally performs the hosting duties. So thanks for moving to a seat on the panel for this one, Aaron, and welcome.
Thanks, Craig. I am excited to be on this side of our virtual studio and handing the mic to you today.
Great. We also have Chad Crabtree with us. Chad is Ultag's Market Director for Renewables. Welcome to you as well, Chad.
Glad to be here, Craig and team.
Sarah Beckman, Ultag's Program Director for Key Clients, also joins us today. Welcome, Sarah.
Thanks, Craig. I'm excited for the conversation.
Great. And finally, Brian Sharpe, Ultag's Market Director for Power. Thanks for joining today, Brian, and welcome to you as well.
Hi, Craig. Also excited to be here. Looking forward to this dialogue.
Great. Let's start out in Washington, D.C. In an address to business leaders recently, Neera Tanden, who is Joe Biden's pick to head the White House Office of Management and Budget, she outlined some of the administration's priorities, and those included climate change and infrastructure, not surprisingly. And we'll talk about those in a minute. But first, in general, with a new administration in place and the Democratic Party now controlling both the House and the Senate, what kind of impact do you think these changes will have in each of your lifeline sectors in 2021? Chad, let's start with you. Does the shift in power change the prospects for energy production in wind and solar markets in 2021 and beyond? And how does the landscape look from your perspective?
Sure. Yeah, we really believe that the renewable market in the U.S. is really strong. Biden administration, a split Senate and control in the House really just makes a strong market even stronger. You know, it's quite evident that the Biden administration cabinet choice really prioritizes climate change. We know that they're going to focus on jobs, and we already know that there's some great work done with the December tax extender bill to accelerate permitting for projects on federal lands.
Great. So a lot of good positive things on the horizon from that perspective. Brian and Sarah, what are your thoughts about this as it relates to power generation, supply, distributions? What changes might we see from your perspective? Sarah, let's start with you.
Sure. I think one of the other things that we'll see from the administration is an increase in corporate taxes. And I expect that increase will lead to ratepayer increases, but that will be offset by some of the pandemic relief bills and things that are in place. So I think that rate increase for ratepayers may be a minimal impact. And then the other thing I think we can expect to see from this administration is vehicle and fleet electrification that is clearly going to have a significant impact on carbon reduction. And that's a key component for the Biden administration. Brian, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree. I think what Chad was saying about the fact that renewable penetration into the grid was already taking place and it's already a strong market. It's just going to be accelerated potentially by policies that Biden puts in place. And another idea is there's the challenge that some of our power utility clients have across the U.S. with renewable penetration, distributed energy resources going onto the grid. It really forces transmission line upgrades and things like this. So will the Biden administration pass something like a green bond market? If the federal government starts to put in green bond at a federal level, that could really allow munis and co-ops to participate in the renewable market and the build out of carbon-free initiatives. Things like transmission lines that are required for extensive renewable penetration, I think there could be policies that help that take shape, that allow utilities to have more participation in the market.
Chad, I'm just curious in terms of renewables, what's the future of subsidies look like from your perspective as we look at legislation in the future relative to subsidizing power and wind?
Yeah, we're still in the midst of the investment tax credit and the production tax credit phase of subsidies, right? So the tax extender bill that came in December created further runway for the investment tax credit on the solar side of the market, as well as making another year extension for production tax credit for onshore wind. Craig, I think long term, where we have to go is some kind of overhaul of carbon tax policy, and that's not done without general tax reform. We're likely several years out, but for the meantime, we continue to have really strong subsidies at the federal level for wind, solar, and bits for storage.
Aaron, I'm going to have you lead off with your thoughts on an infrastructure bill question in a second, but in general, talk about how the current political climate will impact transportation and water.
We know the Senate has a majority with the Democrats, but it's slim. But I think what's really more important to identify is two parts to this. One, transportation infrastructure in general is a natural place to find common ground between the two political parties. And when you look at all the issues, the challenges we as a nation are facing today, that might be a common ground to get something done. Secondly, more importantly, I think where the influence is going to come on, particular to infrastructure, is that we now have Representative DeFazio, a Democrat out of Oregon, chairing the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in the House, and Senator Tom Carper, a Democrat out of Delaware, more than likely going to be chairing the Environmental and Public Works Committee in the Senate. So the big question really, though, again, to that first point, with the administration's agenda, how are they going to prioritize infrastructure over the many challenges, whether, foreign policy, economic unrest, social issues? There's a lot going on in this nation that needs to get figured out. Where is infrastructure and energy going to pile up in that list?
Yeah, Aaron, interesting though, right? You say Senate controlled by Democrats. So we do know that there are several Democrats that have been known to lean across the aisle, potentially are pro-business, pro-infrastructure. It'd be interesting to see how some of those proposed bills play out and if they really are partisan or not.
Yeah, and we've seen both the Democrat and the Republican show their hand the last 2 years with infrastructure bills they've put forward. I think some of those are going to be the framework for what they want to do. The other thing to realize here is COVID, $1 trillion bills, that's a big deal, right? But I think we're also getting kind of numb to that. Like, trillion isn't a big number anymore.
Lots of spending implications for sure. Well, let's transition a little bit and talk specifically about an infrastructure bill. And I want to go back to a quote from Neera Tandon from her earlier comments. As I had mentioned, she's the incoming Office of Management and Budget Chief. She actually said this, and I thought this was kind of interesting. She said, of all the areas, I'm most optimistic that we will retire Infrastructure Week because we will actually pass an infrastructure bill. Aaron, what do you think? Do you agree? What's the likelihood we'll finally see a significant infrastructure bill passed by Congress in 2021, and what does it mean?
No, I do not think they will pass an infrastructure bill. I mentioned that both the Democrats and Republicans have showed their hands. We had House Resolution 2, which was a $1.5 trillion bill from the House. It stalled in the Republican-led Senate. Also, remembering Trump put a $2 trillion infrastructure proposal in front of Congress, and the Republicans didn't want to entertain it. I think a lot of that, going back to the climate, you remember the term Green New Deal. The Republicans definitely saw that as a very pricey way to drive the Green New Deal forward. But again, the common ground is going to be infrastructure. You look at the other issues, again, economic, political, social. This is one that we can find common ground on and move America forward. Not to forget and realize infrastructure generates jobs. And the one thing we need in this nation are jobs. We need to restart the economy and keep it going.
On that same note, Aaron, I would say with the utilities having to manage through shut-off or disconnection moratoria over the last year due to COVID, there's debt piling up. And I think there's going to be a moment where we have to figure out who's going to foot that bill. Is it taxpayers? Is it the utilities? Is it customers? And I think there will probably be discussion and policy around determining that. If Democrats take control, One of the other aspects that we're looking at in the power space is FERC and the Democrats having a majority on the FERC committee chairs. Will that drive different policy around energy? There are some other common ground areas. I think cybersecurity is one of those. That was obviously a priority of the prior administration, but that issue isn't going away for utilities. And I think we'll continue to see some chatter, policy, or talk around that subject as well.
So it sounds like we may all be in agreement that an infrastructure bill is high priority, but maybe doesn't get done this year. Maybe it gets introduced. It seems like high priority items for the first several months in the Biden administration are going to be all about COVID relief.
Well, the one thing, Chad, that might actually drive it and prove me wrong, and for the record, I want to be proved wrong. I want to see an infrastructure bill go forward. Last September, they extended the current highway infrastructure bill that funds most of federal highway and a lot of the infrastructure programs for 1 year. Now, that's still living off the FAST Act, which the Obama administration had put in place, but that expires again in September 30th of 21. So they have to do something. Not to mention, the Highway Trust Fund is supposed to go insolvent this year.
I agree with you. I think that COVID-19 is going to take precedent clearly for the early part of the administration. I'm interested in understanding sort of your thoughts on how COVID has actually impacted each of your sectors through 2020, and what are the implications for your sectors as we move into 2021. And we continue to think about, for instance, Sarah, we talk about massive switches, loads are increased among home users. Americans are converting to working from home. Are we going back to the offices? Does that change the direction of power? What are some of the implications that started in 2020 that actually potentially could have impact in 2021 for each of your areas?
From an electric utility perspective, the load has shifted over the last year more towards the distribution side and away from commercial. That said, many companies and many people are continuing to work from home going into 2021. And I believe that's going to really focus on that build out for the distribution market and for the distribution system. So as we've talked about earlier, grid modernization technologies are going to continue to play a very strong and key role for electric utilities as they focus on asset health. So maintaining and making sure that their existing grid is sufficient and up to speed. And in addition to that, looking forward and incorporating technologies to enhance that distribution grid, help it operate more efficiently, help that distribution grid take on renewable DERs, rooftop solar, and other types of local residential type renewable generation, and figuring out how to incorporate that onto the system. I also think that we could start seeing microgrids here play a larger role, and those are certainly being tested and piloted in different areas. I think that becomes that much more important as we go forward, and residential load is up still significantly in 2021.
I would add that I believe that what COVID did in 2020 is force utilities to determine remote and locational technology solutions to operate their grid. I remember a quote by a leader of a major IOU about mid last year who said, really what COVID did to us is it forced us to accelerate about 2 to 3 years of initiatives and investment in locational and remote technologies in about 2 months. And so what they found is that it's proven to work, and therefore they're moving forward in a more accelerated pace for grid modernization, transmission planning, and technology integration into the grid, smart metering, all of those types of solutions.
Interesting that COVID has actually accelerated initiatives in a positive way. So that's a very interesting implication of the pandemic for sure. Aaron, transportation, obviously some big implications from a perspective of transportation on the pandemic. People cutting back on public transportation, maybe driving more, shifts in terms of the way people are working at home versus going to the office. What does all this mean from a transportation perspective?
Yeah, well, we see a lot of funding that happens for our public entities through gas tax, sales tax. If you're a unique state that's in an oil and gas producing region, generally there's an extraction tax that funds a lot of these programs. When you take away the sales tax from lockdowns, when you take away vehicles on the road from driving, it obviously has a dramatic impact on those revenues that fund a lot of those programs. But the more interesting thing that I think COVID is going to highlight is there's going to be some factors that were pretty obvious that might not work well in agendas. And what I mean by that is when you look at infrastructure bills, one of the big things about Obama's FAST Act was it was really cleaning the air, right? The air, the emissions from vehicles. Clearly, vehicles are a large contributor to emissions. So that answer, let's get cars off the road. Let's get them in mass transit. How many of you are comfortable right now getting in mass transit? The Biden administration is definitely going to be focused on mass transit for the sake of the climate components and being progressive. I think there's going to be a lot of things that happen in this infrastructure bill that are going to have to find common ground related to the climate components that ultimately are going to be better for the infrastructure system that we have focused on transportation and water.
Yeah, so let's move on to and talk a little bit more specifically about climate change. And as we're all well aware, and as you've alluded to, Aaron, climate change and global warming are at the center of many of the challenges we're discussing today. We're seeing a growing number of utilities that are setting carbon-free emissions goals. And I saw a recent article in Bloomberg that stated that while the Democrats now control the Senate, they hold a narrow majority that many groups say will still make broad and ambitious climate legislation difficult. So either way, we'll still need to wrestle with the reality of climate change. So let's talk about that. How do you all think climate change and how companies and consumers are thinking about it will actually influence your lifeline sector? And we can look at this from a policy perspective, as well as addressing the actual practical realities of preparing infrastructure for resiliency for dealing with things like increasingly severe weather events. Chad, your thoughts from your perspective on the renewable side?
Yeah, we've seen utilities across the U.S. as well as many large, medium, and small-sized corporations have made their pledge, right? They've made their pledge to go carbon neutral or even carbon negative in some cases. I think we're at a point now where we're starting to see or we'll see a continuation of many of these large corporations are going to start to require their suppliers, their vendors downstream, as well as folks they work with upstream, to start to lean in and really make that same commitment. So don't be surprised if you start doing work with a Walmart or an Amazon or the like, and if you're a vendor of theirs, they want to see that you've got a similar commitment.
Chad, on that note, I recognize that a lot of the financiers have set targets or set guidelines around if you want to be funded for your project, then you have to make sure you don't have fossil fuel generation in your mix. You're right. We're starting to hear that type of language coming from the banks and the financiers and the money that funds a lot of these projects.
Right. I agree exactly, Chad. I think even on the utility side, we have seen supply chains drive in recent past and certainly going forward diverse and small business goals and small business spend. I wholly expect to see that a company's carbon footprint becomes a key piece of that selection criteria as utilities are making decisions on who they hire and who they want to help do their work. I think that's in the medium horizon. And then when you talk specifically about resiliency and climate change specifically, we know a lot of electric utilities have made carbon-free commitments to be carbon-free, carbon neutral by a certain time period. They need to figure, there's a lot of things that go into that. And part of it is operating the grid more efficiently, operating the grid more effectively. And I think one of the technologies that we'll see in that short-term horizon that's really going to impact that is, as I think Brian had mentioned earlier, these easily deployable sensors that help you determine where you have constraints on your system, to tell you where you can essentially push more electrons through and more efficiently run the grid, as well as identify some of the wildfire zones, hotspots on your line to help mitigate additional consequences from some of these large weather events and catastrophic weather events that we're seeing as well. So I think all of those from a policy side, as well as actual actionable items that utilities are taking, I think that's what we're seeing here and going forward.
Are utilities actually taking specific actions now? Are you guys seeing that in regards to kind of shoring up their infrastructures and being prepared for these weather events? Or are they actually making investments at this stage?
No question. When you look at last year, and we had over double the number of hurricanes in the Atlantic than we do on an average year, the wildfires out west, the Midwest storm derecho that wreaked havoc on the power lines up there, utilities are recognizing that these extreme weather events really probably aren't going away long term. And so how do you invest in your grid to make sure that operationally you can get back up and running as quickly as possible? How can you make sure that it's resilient enough to weather some of these extreme storms with minimal damage and mitigate the damage? And really, if Congress did approve an infrastructure bill or possibly some kind of funding for climate change, if that actually does happen, I really see funds being earmarked for that power infrastructure resiliency.
So let's talk about technology and what that looks like into the future. I'm curious to know what each of you are watching that will help to transform lifeline sectors where you operate in the next 2 to 5 years. And there's a good chance that we're going to see technologies crossing over each of your sectors: power, renewables, transportation, water. When we talk about electric vehicles and the necessary network of charging stations for them, smart highways, battery technology in general. Can you all talk a little bit about what technology and what new technology means for your sectors and where potentially you see some of those crossovers?
I think the obvious one for us in renewables space is to be watching energy storage, really focus on a long-term, long-duration solution. I'm really curious to see where big data plays in, the trading of electrons, if you will. If you look at the role of artificial intelligence, connected everything, potential alternative cryptocurrencies, how do we trade electrons rather than simply overbuild with dispatchable resources, right? So I think it's a combination for us in renewables. It's storage so that we can clip and shave the peak, provide that resource down the road or later in the evening or early in the morning. But it's all about connected everything and big data.
Aaron, what do you think from your world, from the perspective of transportation and water and what the future holds?
So we're seeing utilities that are, using a lot of leading edge technology to enhance water quality. One of the hot topics in the water industry right now are forever chemicals, and identifying them and tracking them and treating for them. We're going to need new technologies that really treat that effectively across the systems. Water infrastructure today from a treatment perspective is underfunded. It's dilapidated. There's a lot of challenges that are happening there. And now we're introducing more things, as we should, in the water industry that we need to be watching for. So we're going to have to enhance that technology, and really, where's that cost effectiveness where technology often comes in? It starts out expensive, but as technology evolves, it allows the cost to be reduced. As far as transportation goes, I don't know if any of you have seen Elon Musk has put out his 10 predictions for 2021, and one of them is self-driving cars. Now, I was at an ACEC conference last year in DC where Federal Highway said 2040 is as soon as they'll let that happen. There's a big delta, big gap between 2021 and 2040. But I think there's an iteration between that, which is connected vehicles. The feds have required that all vehicles produced after 2023, many of them, just like electric vehicles, are already installing the technology. And really, connected vehicles is the first step in getting to autonomous vehicles, where vehicles are talking to infrastructure, talking to other cars. I think that's going to become very predominant. Ultimately, that's what's going to drive us to autonomous vehicles. I do not see autonomous vehicles in 2021. I am not making that prediction. I'll leave that to Elon Musk. I'm predicting we will see a jump in connected vehicles.
So curious, Aaron, as you see more connected vehicles and bigger penetration of EVs across the U.S., who pays for that? Who pays for the infrastructure, the charging stations on the distribution network? Is that the utility?
Yeah, traditionally in our capitalist society, those who earn the revenue charge the rates, right? I think, EVs are big, and I think we really want them, just like a lot of technology. We want it. The reality is that EVs will only be determined by consumers. When consumers really start buying EVs is when the infrastructure is going to come. And when it happens, we as an industry will absolutely see the opportunity. You're talking about a market shifting from which historically has been, the revenues going to petroleum companies, is now going to shift. It's going to be this paradigm that now utilities have a source of revenue they've never had before. I'm pretty sure we'll be quick to get infrastructure in place to support EVs.
I couldn't agree more, Aaron. And I would also add that it's not just personal vehicles. You have to look at fleet as well. And I think that'll have a big impact when you start seeing entire fleets of trucks or manufacturing or what have you go to electrification. That's going to drive significant shift in load and revenue for utilities.
Yeah, but don't you think, just like trying to get rid of cigarettes, you put a cigarette tax on there. If you're trying to get rid of combustion engine vehicles, well, why not tax?
It's going to be consumers. I mean, you're not going to be able to eliminate internal combustion engines that quickly. Not to mention, do you know how much it costs to put a charging station in your garage? The price has got to come down, which I think will happen because we're seeing all the manufacturers are releasing all their lines of vehicles in some form of an EV. It's going to come, but 2021, no.
This is great conversation. It actually is drifting into sort of what I'd like to wrap up with. We've already started talking about kind of what the future looks like and what the implications are within each of the lifeline sectors. A couple questions for each of you guys as we depart here. First of all, as you think about the next, 10 to 15 years, what are you most excited about in your lifeline sectors? What are the things that you think are going to be most interesting? And then what is the thing or things that you think your stakeholders in your respective sectors, what is keeping them up at night? So what are the two things? Maybe start with the challenging one, then end on the positive, what you're excited about. Sarah, what do you think?
Great question, Craig. I see, as we look on the horizon, I think the thing that's keeping a lot of electric utilities up at night is the need to stay relevant in the future, and how can they become more competitive. We're seeing renewable owner operators enter the space. We're seeing third parties start providing power delivery CCAs. So where we as consumers can get our electricity, that's going to start to become a much more competitive space. And electric utilities need to find a way to stay relevant and play in that space. I think the other question becomes, for the broader group, between all of these people that are trying to own assets and do own assets, is who pays for that power delivery infrastructure, right? You can have renewable generation, but how do you get it from where it's generated to where it's being consumed? That said, I am so, maybe one of the silver linings that actually comes out of this pandemic is the accelerated technology. I really do feel like we're on this pinnacle in the electric utility industry with the adoption of technology, as we look at just how we can revolutionize and upgrade this grid, how we can take what we've done at the transmission level and make a smart distribution grid and integrate all of these technologies to help the grid run more efficiently, safely, and more cost effectively.
What are you excited about, Brian?
I'm really excited about the technology aspect of really just our entire power grid, whether that's the utilities themselves or the developers and owner operators of generation, and the advancement of smart technology being implemented in a way that allows not just the manufacturers, the utilities, the customers of electricity to take more advantage of it in a cleaner way, but also the idea that our grid can be operated in a way that's more efficient, more resilient, and not just more resilient to weather, but to cyber attacks and things like that. I just think we're at this linchpin moment in the energy space. It's almost like 100-year shift of, we've been centralized generation for so long. As it becomes decentralized, it's forcing an advancement in technology that could have ancillary benefit that's really exciting to think about.
What is keeping your stakeholders up at night, Brian?
Yeah, when it comes to the utility industry, I think a lot of utilities are thinking about weather events and impacts to the grid and how they are going to afford or budget for or get the money to pay for transmission resiliency, to pay for the storm response that's needed in these emergencies. And so that spend is something that is a real concern and keeps them up at night, not only due to the financial aspect of it, but also their customers and outages and how do they get the grid back up quickly. So that's a real key concern.
Aaron, I know you've talked a lot very enthusiastically about the future of transportation. What's on your mind, and what do you think is keeping your stakeholders up at night?
answer is always funding. That's what keeps everyone up at night. But from a different perspective, everybody wants to know how their projects are going to get funded. I think a lot of the decision makers and planners as part of the transportation infrastructure and the water infrastructure, the way that we've approached it in the past is to build out, build more, build wider, expand. The reality is that the cost to maintain that infrastructure is 3 times its initial capital cost. That is why we are in such a hole right now. We can't pay for what we've already built. I think there's an opportunity to enhance what they call TSMO, Traffic Systems Management Operations. And really it's about a set of strategies that takes your current infrastructure that you have and how do you optimize that. I don't think that EVs will have a large impact on the transportation system as an infrastructure network. But I think that autonomous vehicles, now you're actually changing the width of roads. You're changing traffic signal timing. You're changing congestion. But what really keeps the DOTs up at night and what these solutions are driving to are traffic fatalities. That is what keeps the DOTs up at night. They have Vision Zero across all the DOTs, which is to get traffic fatalities to 0. The technologies that are coming about, whether autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, managing current infrastructure to reduce congestion is all focused on, yes, increasing air quality and yes, reducing your congestion time or your time you're on the road, but more importantly, to enhance safety. And I think we have a unique opportunity to tackle that as a society.
Yeah, there's a lot of exciting aspects of what you're talking about there, which is just terrific. Chad, wrap up for us. Leave us on a high note. What do you think from your perspective, your side of the world?
We've seen considerable cost reductions in wind and solar utility scale to the point where it's the cheapest form of generation in the U.S. And so that's all good, right? I think what's keeping our clients up at night at this point is there's a tremendous demand for additional projects to come online. And because we still are in this federal incentive program, there's limited tax equity, right? So there's more projects than there is tax equity funding. I think that's a short-term problem up until the point where there's holistic carbon tax policy reform. But I think near-term, what's keeping our clients up at night is how do we bring more complex projects every day? How do we bring more of them online quicker?
What are you excited about?
I'm excited about so many projects. Tremendous demand in the market. I'm excited that they're growing increasingly complex. My colleagues are well poised to focus on those complex projects. We're grid experts and really excited to see what a connected everything world looks like in the future.
Terrific. Great. Well, thank you. It's time for us to wrap this up. This has been a very informative discussion. I'd like to thank each of our panelists today, Aaron, Chad, Brian, and Sarah. Appreciate your insights and the conversation that took place. I think obviously lots of things to think about as we move into 2021 and think about the upcoming legislative sessions, as well as what the industry holds for us in the future. I'd also like to thank our listeners for joining us for this Ultag Trends podcast. We invite you to visit ultag.com. And if you found this podcast informative, please let us know. You can send us comments to connect@ultag.com. And on behalf of all of us at Ultag, thanks for listening and have a great day.
Thank you for listening. Share our podcast and don't forget to subscribe to catch our next episode as our series continues to track the stimulus packages and we provide in-depth interviews with industry leaders and experts. Check us out at ultag.com where we listen, we solve.